Welcome to our journey through the shadowy world of vampire legends. Tonight, we begin with a tale that bridges the gap between historical reality and supernatural myth. Close your eyes, let your breathing slow, and allow yourself to drift back through the centuries to a time when the line between monster and man was dangerously thin. Our story begins in the mist-shrouded lands of Wallachia, in what is now southern Romania, during the turbulent 15th century. Here, in a world of constant warfare, political intrigue, and unspeakable cruelty, was born a man whose very name would become synonymous with darkness itself. His name was Vlad, but history would remember him by another title entirely. Vlad the Impaler, known in his native tongue as Vlad Tepes. Picture, if you will, the fortress of Sigashora in the year 1431. The stone walls rise like ancient sentinels against the Carpathian mountains, their shadows dancing in the flickering torchlight. It is here, in this medieval stronghold, that our tale truly begins. Vlad Dracula was born into a world already steeped in blood and betrayal. His father, Vlad II, bore the surname Dracul, meaning dragon, after being inducted into the Order of the Dragon, a secret society dedicated to defending Christian Europe against the advancing Ottoman Empire. The infant prince entered a realm where survival meant embracing ruthlessness, where mercy was often seen as weakness, and where the very concept of human compassion seemed as foreign as the distant stars above. Young Vlad's childhood was marked not by the gentle lullabies that might soothe you to sleep tonight, but by the harsh realities of medieval politics and warfare. When Vlad was merely 11 years old, his world changed forever. The Ottoman Sultan Murad II demanded hostages as a guarantee of his father's loyalty, and both Vlad and his younger brother, Radu, were taken to the Ottoman court. Imagine, as you settle deeper into comfort, this young boy torn from everything familiar and thrust into an alien world where survival depended entirely on cunning and adaptation. For 6 long years, Vlad lived among the Ottomans, learning their ways, their language, their methods of warfare and governance. But more importantly, he learned their methods of punishment and intimidation. The young prince observed firsthand the brutal efficiency with which the Ottoman Empire maintained order through fear. These lessons would prove formative, shaping the man who would later become both a national hero and a figure of absolute terror. The Ottoman court was a place of incredible sophistication and equally incredible cruelty. Here, young Vlad witnessed executions carried out with methodical precision, saw how fear could be wielded as effectively as any sword, and learned that in the game of power, only the most ruthless survived. While other children his age might have been learning to read gentle stories or play innocent games, Vlad was receiving an education in the darkest arts of human nature. During these formative years, his younger brother Radu adapted well to Ottoman life, eventually converting to Islam and becoming a favorite of the future Sultan Mehmed II. But Vlad remained different, resistant, nursing a growing hatred for his captors that would burn within him like an eternal flame. This hatred would later fuel actions so extreme that they would echo through the centuries, eventually inspiring the most famous vampire tale ever written. When Vlad finally returned to Wallachia in 1448, he was no longer the frightened child who had been taken away. He had become something harder, colder, more calculating. The 17-year-old prince had learned that in a world where might made right, only the most feared could hope to rule effectively. His father was dead, murdered by rebellious boyars and their Hungarian allies, and his older brother had been tortured and killed in the most gruesome manner imaginable. The young man who reclaimed his father's throne was driven by an almost supernatural thirst for revenge and an unwavering determination to restore Wallachian independence. But the methods he would employ to achieve these goals would earn him a reputation that transcended the boundaries of normal human behavior, crossing into the realm of the monstrous. Vlad's first reign was brief, lasting only 2 months before he was forced to flee. But this early taste of power, combined with his years of Ottoman captivity, had crystallized his worldview into something truly terrifying. When he finally secured the throne permanently in 1456, he began implementing a reign of terror that would make his name legendary throughout Europe. The young prince had developed what can only be described as an obsession with impalement, a method of execution he had observed during his time in Ottoman captivity. But Vlad refined this ancient practice into an art form of systematic terror. He did not simply order executions, he orchestrated elaborate displays of cruelty designed to paralyze his enemies with fear. Picture the forests of stakes that began to appear throughout Wallachia, each one carefully positioned to maximize the psychological impact on anyone who might dare oppose the prince. These were not random acts of violence, but calculated instruments of policy designed to send a clear message to both internal and external enemies. Resistance would not merely be punished, it would be answered with torments beyond imagination. The Ottomans, who had thought they understood cruelty, found themselves facing an opponent who had taken their own lessons and amplified them to previously unimaginable levels. When Ottoman envoys came to demand tribute, Vlad reportedly had their turbans nailed to their heads because they refused to remove them in his presence. When merchants cheated in the marketplace, they found themselves impaled alongside the roads as a warning to others. But perhaps most telling of all were Vlad's campaigns against the boyars, the native nobility who had betrayed and murdered his father. On Easter Sunday of 1459, during what should have been a celebration of renewal and forgiveness, Vlad invited all the boyar families to a great feast. As they sat at his table, enjoying what they believed to be a gesture of reconciliation, the prince's guards surrounded them. The older boyars were impaled immediately, their bodies left as a gruesome reminder of the price of treachery. The younger and stronger members of the nobility were forced to march through the mountains to the ruins of Castle Poenari, where they were compelled to rebuild the fortress stone by stone. Many died from exhaustion, their bodies added to the growing collection of corpses that seemed to follow Vlad wherever he went. This castle, perched high on a cliff overlooking the Argus River, became Vlad's primary stronghold and a symbol of his absolute power. Even today, its ruins whisper tales of the horrors that were planned within its walls, where a mortal man crossed the line into something that seemed almost supernatural in its capacity for cruelty. As word of Vlad's methods spread throughout Europe, stories began to grow in the telling. Tales spoke of a prince who dined among forests of impaled victims, who showed no more emotion while ordering mass executions than another man might display while choosing his evening meal. Some accounts claimed he drank the blood of his enemies, though whether this was literal truth or metaphorical description born from the sheer extremity of his cruelty remains lost to history. The psychological impact of Vlad's reign extended far beyond the borders of his small principality. Ottoman armies, accustomed to striking fear into the hearts of their enemies, found themselves unnerved by reports of the Wallachian prince's methods. Hungarian chroniclers wrote of a ruler whose cruelty surpassed anything in recorded history, while German merchants spread tales of a monster who wore the crown of a Christian prince. By the time of his final defeat and death in 1476, Vlad had created a legend that would far outlive his mortal existence. The historical prince died as mortals do, his head severed and sent to the Ottoman Sultan as proof of his death. But the stories of his life had already begun to transform him into something more than human, something that belonged as much to the realm of nightmare as to the world of political history. These tales would travel through the centuries, growing darker and more supernatural with each retelling. Eventually, they would reach the ears of an Irish author named Bram Stoker, who would weave them into a story that would give birth to the most famous vampire in literary history. The historical Vlad Tepes would become the fictional Count Dracula, trading his mortality for eternal life in the pages of literature. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider this transformation from man to monster to myth. Vlad the Impaler began as a traumatized child, became a ruler whose cruelty knew no bounds, and finally evolved into an immortal creature of the night who continues to fascinate and terrify us more than 5 centuries after his death. The mists of Wallachia have long since cleared, the forests of stakes have crumbled to dust, and the castle walls that once echoed with screams now stand silent under the stars. But the legend born from one man's descent into absolute darkness continues to cast its shadow across our collective imagination, reminding us that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are those that begin as recognizably human. Sleep well and dream of quieter times, far from the blood-soaked fields of medieval Wallachia, where a prince's thirst for revenge gave birth to the most enduring vampire legend of all time. As the echoes of Vlad's reign fade into the mists of time, our journey through the darkness leads us to another figure whose name has become synonymous with vampiric legend. In the rolling hills of Hungary, where ancient castles pierce the sky like stone fingers reaching toward heaven, there lived a woman whose beauty was matched only by her cruelty, whose vanity would drive her to acts so horrific that they would inspire centuries of vampire folklore. Elizabeth Bathory was born on August 7th, 1560, into one of the most powerful noble families in Hungary. The Bathory name carried weight throughout the Hungarian kingdom, and Elizabeth's lineage connected her to kings, princes, and warriors whose deeds had shaped the political landscape of Eastern Europe. Yet within this noble bloodline ran currents of madness and violence that would manifest most terribly in the young countess. The Hungary of Elizabeth's birth was a land caught between empires, where the Ottoman tide pressed ever northward, and where Hungarian nobles maintained their power through alliances, betrayals, and the careful balancing of competing interests. Into this world of political intrigue and constant warfare, Elizabeth entered as a prize to be bartered, a strategic asset in the endless chess game of noble politics. At the tender age of 11, Elizabeth was betrothed to Ferenc Nadasdy, a member of another powerful Hungarian family. This arrangement, like most noble marriages of the era, had nothing to do with love and everything to do with the consolidation of wealth and power. The young girl found herself promised to a man 15 years her senior, a seasoned warrior known throughout Hungary for his prowess in battle against the Ottoman forces. The wedding took place in 1575 when Elizabeth was 15 years old. The ceremony was one of the grandest spectacles of the Hungarian social season, attended by nobles from across the kingdom. Yet beneath the pageantry and celebration lay the seeds of a union that would prove catastrophic not only for the bride and groom, but for hundreds of innocent souls whose lives would be forfeit to Elizabeth's growing appetite for cruelty. Ferenc Nadasti was known as the Black Knight of Hungary, a title earned through his fearsome reputation on the battlefield. His methods of warfare were brutal even by the standards of his time, and stories circulated throughout Hungary of his particular talent for devising creative tortures for captured Ottoman soldiers. Some historians suggest that it was from her husband that Elizabeth first learned the techniques of systematic cruelty that would later make her infamous. The newlyweds took up residence in Sade Castle, a imposing fortress perched atop a rocky outcrop in what is now Slovakia. The castle's thick walls and strategic position made it an ideal military stronghold, but for Elizabeth, it would become something far more sinister, a laboratory where she would perfect her methods of torture and murder, hidden from the eyes of the outside world. Ferenc's military campaigns meant that he was frequently absent from the castle for months at a time, leaving Elizabeth to manage the vast estates and their hundreds of servants and peasants. This isolation, combined with her absolute authority over the castle's inhabitants, created the perfect conditions for the young countess to indulge her darker impulses without fear of immediate consequence. The first signs of Elizabeth's cruelty appeared early in her marriage. Servants began to whisper of harsh punishments that seemed to exceed even the brutal norms of the era. A maid who spilled wine might find herself beaten with a barbed whip. A cook who prepared a meal to the countess's dissatisfaction might be dragged to the castle's dungeons for days of torture. These early acts of violence were dismissed by those who heard of them as the unfortunate but unremarkable cruelties of noble privilege. But Elizabeth's appetite for violence was growing, fed by the absolute power she wielded within the castle walls, and perhaps by the influence of servants who shared her taste for cruelty. Chief among these was Anna Darvulia, an older woman rumored to practice witchcraft, who became Elizabeth's closest confidant and possibly her lover. Under Anna's influence, Elizabeth's methods became more sophisticated, more systematic, and infinitely more cruel. The Countess began to develop what can only be described as a scientific approach to torture. She experimented with different methods of inflicting pain, keeping detailed mental notes of which techniques produced the most satisfying results. Servants were subjected to burnings, beatings, freezing, and mutilations that often resulted in death. Those who survived one session might find themselves subjected to another, as Elizabeth refined her techniques with the cold precision of a natural philosopher studying the properties of matter. When Ferenc died in 1594, Elizabeth's transformation accelerated dramatically. No longer constrained even by the minimal oversight of an absent husband, she began to recruit accomplices who shared her taste for violence. Dorothea Sentes, known as Dorca, became her primary assistant in torture. Ilona Jo, called Helena, served as Elizabeth's procurer, luring young women to the castle with promises of employment. Johannes Uivari, known as Fichko, handled the disposal of bodies and assisted in the more physically demanding aspects of torture. Together, this group transformed Chejte Castle into a charnel house where young women disappeared with terrifying regularity. The victims were primarily peasant girls and daughters of minor nobility, attracted to the castle by offers of positions as servants or ladies in waiting. Once within the castle walls, they found themselves trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. Elizabeth's methods during this period reveal a level of creativity and cruelty that borders on the supernatural. Victims were beaten with clubs, embedded with nails, burned with red hot pokers, and subjected to freezing temperatures until their skin cracked and bled. Some were forced to strip naked and stand in the castle courtyard during winter nights until they froze to death. Others were tortured with devices that seemed designed more to prolong suffering than to achieve any practical purpose. But it was Elizabeth's obsession with blood that would eventually give rise to the vampire legends associated with her name. Witnesses later testified that the Countess had developed a belief that bathing in the blood of young virgins would preserve her youth and beauty. Whether this practice was literal or metaphorical remains a subject of historical debate, but the image of Elizabeth bathing in blood became central to her legend. According to the testimonies given during her eventual trial, Elizabeth would have servants drain the blood of her victims into large tubs where she would immerse herself completely. Some accounts describe elaborate rituals surrounding these bloodbaths, with Elizabeth's accomplices chanting incantations while the Countess performed what can only be described as vampiric ceremonies. The Countess's reputation for beauty was legendary throughout Hungary, and as she aged, her desperation to maintain her youthful appearance grew increasingly frantic. This vanity, combined with her sadistic pleasure in causing pain, created a deadly combination that would claim hundreds of lives over the course of nearly 2 decades. The scale of Elizabeth's crimes was staggering, even by the standards of an era when life was cheap. Conservative estimates suggest that she was responsible for the deaths of at least 80 young women, though some accounts place the number far higher. A servant's diary allegedly found at the castle supposedly contained the names of over 600 victims, though the authenticity of this document remains disputed by historians. The end began to approach for Elizabeth Bathory in 1610 when she made a fatal mistake. Perhaps emboldened by years of impunity or driven by an increasing need for victims of higher social status, she began targeting daughters of minor nobility rather than limiting herself to peasant girls. When several daughters of lesser nobles disappeared after visiting Chete Castle, their families had the political connections necessary to demand investigations. King Matthias II of Hungary, faced with mounting pressure from noble families and rumors that threatened to destabilize the region, authorized his palatine, Georgi Thurzo, to investigate the allegations against Elizabeth. Thurzo, who was related to Elizabeth by marriage, initially hoped to handle the matter quietly, but what he discovered at Sagete Castle exceeded even his worst expectations. On December 29, 1610, Thurzo's forces surrounded Sagete Castle and entered by force. What they found inside would be described in court documents as scenes from hell itself. The castle's dungeons contained the tortured bodies of recently killed victims, while others were found in various stages of torture, some still clinging to life. The evidence of systematic murder was so overwhelming that even Elizabeth's noble status could not protect her from prosecution. Elizabeth Bathory was arrested along with her primary accomplices. During the subsequent trial, dozens of witnesses testified to the Countess's crimes, providing details so horrific that some transcripts were sealed and remained classified for centuries. The testimonies painted a picture of a woman who had descended so far into sadistic madness that she seemed to represent pure evil in human form. Her accomplices were executed in brutal fashion, their punishments designed to reflect the cruelty they had helped inflict on others. Dorca and Helena had their fingers torn out with red-hot pincers before being burned alive. Fichko, being a man and therefore considered more culpable, was decapitated before his body was burned. Only Elizabeth herself escaped execution, her noble blood providing protection that her victims had never enjoyed. Instead of death, Elizabeth was sentenced to solitary confinement for the remainder of her life. The windows and doors of her chambers in Shejte Castle were bricked up, leaving only small openings for food and air. In this tomb-like existence, the woman who had once been celebrated as one of Hungary's great beauties spent her final years in darkness and isolation. Elizabeth Bathory died on August 21st, 1614, after nearly 4 years of imprisonment. Her guards found her body lying face down on the floor of her sealed chamber, and she was buried without ceremony in the church at Shejte. Even in death, she remained controversial. Local residents complained that her presence in consecrated ground was causing supernatural disturbances, and her body was eventually moved to the Bathory family crypt. The legend of Elizabeth Bathory as a vampire emerged gradually in the centuries following her death. The image of a beautiful woman bathing in the blood of virgins to maintain her youth proved irresistible to storytellers and eventually influenced vampire literature profoundly. Unlike Vlad the Impaler, whose vampiric associations were primarily literary, Elizabeth's connection to blood was documented in court records and witness testimonies. Her story represents a unique fusion of historical fact and vampiric legend, where the documented crimes of a real person were so extreme that they seemed to transcend normal human evil and enter the realm of the supernatural. The Blood Countess became a template for the female vampire, the seductive predator who uses beauty to lure victims to their doom. As the centuries passed, Elizabeth Bathory's legend continued to evolve, inspiring countless works of literature, film, and art. She became the archetypal female vampire, the woman whose vanity and cruelty transformed her into something inhuman. Her story serves as a bridge between the historical roots of vampire legends and their modern incarnations, showing how real human monsters can become the stuff of supernatural nightmares. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, consider the transformation of Elizabeth Bathory from a beautiful young noblewoman to a legendary monster. Her story reminds us that sometimes the most terrifying vampires are not the supernatural creatures of fiction, but the very real human beings whose capacity for evil seems to transcend the boundaries of mortality itself. The legends of Vlad and Elizabeth, terrifying as they are, represent only the most recent chapters in humanity's long relationship with creatures that feed upon blood and life itself. To truly understand the vampire, we must journey much further back in time to the very dawn of human civilization, where the first whispers of these dark beings emerged from the collective fears and nightmares of our ancestors. Long before the castles of Transylvania cast their shadows across the Carpathian Mountains, long before the name Bathory became synonymous with blood soaked cruelty, ancient peoples across the world were already telling stories of creatures that stalked the night, seeking to drain the life from the living. These primordial vampire legends arose independently in cultures separated by vast distances and centuries of time, suggesting something fundamental in human nature that gives birth to such fears. In the earliest recorded civilization of Mesopotamia, among the clay tablets of Babylon and Assyria, we find our first written accounts of vampiric beings. Here in cuneiform script, pressed into clay nearly 4,000 years ago, scribes recorded tales of creatures that would later evolve into our modern concept of the vampire. The most famous of these ancient beings was Lilith, a name that still carries power and dread even today. According to Mesopotamian mythology, Lilith was the first woman created before Eve, fashioned from the same clay as Adam. But unlike the submissive Eve, Lilith refused to accept a subordinate role, demanding equality with her male counterpart. When Adam and the divine powers rejected her demands, Lilith fled to the shores of the Red Sea, where she mated with demons and gave birth to a race of supernatural beings known as the Lilim. The Lilith of these ancient texts was described as a creature of terrible beauty, with long flowing hair and wings like those of a great bird of prey. She flew through the night, seeking newborn children, whom she would steal from their mother's arms to drink their blood and consume their life force. Pregnant women wore amulets bearing protective spells to ward off Lilith's influence, while new mothers would hang iron knives above their babies' cradles to prevent the demon from approaching. But Lilith's appetite was not limited to children. The texts describe her as a succubus who would visit sleeping men, draining their vital essence through seduction and leaving them weakened or dead by morning. This aspect of her legend established one of the key characteristics of vampire folklore: the connection between sexual desire and the consumption of life force, a theme that would persist through thousands of years and countless retellings. Moving westward from Mesopotamia, we encounter the vampire legends of ancient Greece, where beings called empusae stalked the night roads. These creatures were said to be the daughters of Hecate, goddess of magic and the crossroads, and they appeared to travelers as beautiful women who would seduce their victims before revealing their true nature. The empusae had one leg of bronze and one leg of a donkey, though they could disguise this deformity when appearing in human form. Like their Mesopotamian counterparts, the empusae fed on blood and flesh, but they also consumed something more intangible, the life force or soul of their victims. Greek philosophers debated whether these beings were literal creatures or symbolic representations of the destructive power of uncontrolled desire. But for the common people who told and retold these stories around flickering fires, the empusae were very real threats that required constant vigilance. Related to the empusae were the lamii, snake women who were said to have once been human but were transformed into monsters by the jealous rage of Hera, Zeus's wife. The original Lamia was a beautiful queen of Libya who caught Zeus's attention and bore him several children. When Hera discovered the affair, she killed all of Lamia's children and transformed the grieving mother into a creature doomed to hunt and devour the children of others. The Lamiae could take on the appearance of beautiful women, using their supernatural allure to lure victims, particularly young men, to isolated places where they would feed upon their blood and flesh. Some versions of the legend claimed that Lamiae could remove their eyes at will, storing them in jars while they slept, making them vulnerable during daylight hours when they were blind and defenseless. These Greek vampire legends established another crucial element of vampire mythology: the idea that vampires were once human beings who had been transformed by tragedy, curse, or divine punishment. This concept of the vampire as a fallen human rather than a purely demonic entity would become central to later vampire stories and helps explain the sympathy that many people feel for vampiric characters, even as they fear them. In the mythology of ancient Rome, we encounter the Strix, creatures that combined elements of vampire and witch. Originally described as nocturnal birds that fed on human blood and flesh, the Strix later evolved into shape-shifting beings that could appear in human form. The Roman poet Ovid wrote of these creatures in his Fasti, describing them as birds with crooked beaks and talons that would sneak into homes at night to attack sleeping infants. The Strix were particularly feared because they were said to possess the ability to cast spells and curses, making them more than simple blood-drinking monsters. They represented a fusion of vampiric and magical elements that would later influence European witch trials and vampire hysteria. Roman mothers would perform elaborate rituals to protect their children from the Strix, including placing hawthorn branches around cribs and drawing protective symbols on doors and windows. Far to the north, among the Celtic peoples of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, entirely different but remarkably similar, vampire legends emerged. The Irish told stories of the Dearg Dhu, literally meaning red bloodsucker, a vampiric being that rose from the grave to seek revenge on those who had wronged them in life. Unlike many other vampiric creatures, the Dearg Dhu retained their human appearance and intelligence, making them particularly dangerous because they could blend seamlessly into human society. The most famous tale of a Dearg Dhu tells of a beautiful young woman who was forced into marriage with a cruel and abusive man, while her true love, a poor but kind youth, was driven away by her father's greed. The young woman died of a broken heart and was buried in a remote churchyard. But her anguish and desire for revenge were so strong that she rose from her grave, appearing as she had in life, but with pale skin and blood-red lips. The Dearg Dhu sought out her cruel husband and father, as well as others who had contributed to her misery, draining their blood and life force before returning to her grave before dawn. The only way to stop a Dearg Dhu was to pile stones upon their grave, physically preventing them from rising, or to drive a wooden stake through their heart while they rested in their coffin. Celtic vampire legends often emphasized themes of justice and revenge, with the vampiric beings serving as instruments of cosmic balance, punishing those who had committed crimes or acted with cruelty toward the innocent. This moral dimension to vampire stories would later influence Christian interpretations of vampirism, where vampires were sometimes seen as divine punishment for sin. Across the vast expanse of Slavic Eastern Europe, vampire legends developed their own unique characteristics while sharing common elements with the vampire myths of other cultures. The Slavic peoples spoke of upirs, vampires, and vertalaks, creatures that rose from their graves to feed upon the blood of the living. These beings were often created when someone died under violent or unnatural circumstances, or when proper funeral rites were not observed. Slavic vampires were typically more corpse like in appearance than their Mediterranean counterparts, often described as bloated, pale beings with blood staining their lips and fingernails. They could take the form of animals, particularly wolves and bats, and possessed supernatural strength and the ability to control weather and animals. Unlike the seductive vampires of Greek and Roman mythology, Slavic vampires were generally portrayed as revolting creatures that inspired disgust rather than desire. The Slavic concept of vampirism was closely tied to Orthodox Christian beliefs about the soul and the afterlife. Vampires were seen as souls that could not find rest due to sins committed in life or improper burial practices. This religious dimension gave Slavic vampire legends a moral complexity that would later influence vampire stories throughout Europe and eventually around the world. In the far reaches of Eastern Europe, among the Russian peoples, tales were told of the upir, creatures similar to other Slavic vampires, but with distinctive characteristics. Russian upirs were said to be particularly active during times of plague and famine, suggesting a connection between vampirism and social catastrophe. They were believed to rise from their graves primarily at night, though some could walk during the day, and they possessed an insatiable hunger not just for blood, but for all forms of life energy. Russian vampire legends often included detailed instructions for identifying and destroying these creatures. A suspected vampire grave could be identified by the presence of small holes in the earth above the coffin, through which the vampire would emerge as mist or in animal form. To destroy an upir permanently, the body had to be exhumed and either burned completely or decapitated with a blessed axe or sword. Moving eastward across the Silk Road, we encounter entirely different vampire traditions in the vast lands of China. Chinese vampire legends center around beings called jiangshi, often translated as hopping vampires or zombie vampires. These creatures were fundamentally different from Western vampires in both appearance and behavior, reflecting the unique spiritual and philosophical traditions of Chinese culture. Jiangshi were typically described as reanimated corpses with greenish-white skin, black fingernails, and a covering of white or green mold. They moved by hopping because rigor mortis had stiffened their joints, and they held their arms outstretched in front of them. Unlike Western vampires, jiangshi were driven not by a thirst for blood, but by a need to absorb the life force or breath of living beings. Chinese vampire legends were deeply influenced by Taoist beliefs about the soul and the afterlife. According to these traditions, the human soul consisted of multiple components, and if these elements became imbalanced after death, particularly if the Po soul became dominant over the Hun soul, the result could be a jiangshi. These creatures were more like animated corpses than the sophisticated, intelligent vampires of European legend, but they shared the essential characteristic of feeding on life energy from the living. The creation of jiangshi was often attributed to improper burial practices, violent death, or the influence of negative energy. Chinese folklore included elaborate rituals for preventing the creation of jiangshus, including specific positioning of the corpse, the use of protective talismans, and the performance of proper funeral rites. Taoist priests were considered experts in dealing with jiangshi, using yellow paper talismans inscribed with spells to immobilize or destroy these creatures. In the tropical islands of Southeast Asia, vampire legends took on yet another form, adapted to the unique environment and cultural traditions of the region. Malaysian and Indonesian folklore speaks of the penanggalan, a vampiric creature that appears as a floating head with trailing entrails. This horrifying being was said to be created when a woman practicing black magic was interrupted during a ritual, causing her head to separate from her body. The penanggalan would fly through the night, seeking pregnant women and newborn children, using its long, invisible tongue to reach through floorboards and drain blood from victims. This creature embodied fears specific to tropical cultures, where diseases spread rapidly and infant mortality was high, and where the boundary between the natural and supernatural seemed particularly thin. African vampire legends, though less well documented by early European scholars, were equally rich and varied. In West African folklore, creatures called obayifo were vampiric beings that could take human form during the day but revealed their true nature at night. These beings were said to possess glowing red eyes and the ability to slip through the smallest cracks and openings, making no barrier truly effective against them. The Obayifo shared characteristics with both European and Asian vampire legends while maintaining distinctly African elements. They were particularly associated with crop failure and livestock disease, reflecting the agricultural focus of many African societies. Like vampires in other cultures, the Obayifo were often created through witchcraft or as punishment for breaking cultural taboos. What emerges from this survey of global vampire legends is a remarkable consistency in certain core elements, despite the vast differences in culture, geography, and historical period. Across all these traditions, vampires are beings that exist in the liminal space between life and death, neither fully alive nor completely dead. They feed on some form of life energy, whether blood, breath, or spiritual essence. They are often created through violation of natural or cultural laws, whether through improper burial, violent death, or supernatural curse. Perhaps most significantly, vampires in virtually all traditions are former humans who have been transformed by trauma, punishment, or accident. This human origin distinguishes vampires from demons or other purely supernatural entities and helps explain their enduring appeal in human storytelling. They represent our fears about death, about the possibility that death might not be final, and about the thin line that separates civilization from savagery. These ancient vampire legends provided the foundation upon which later European vampire beliefs would build. As trade routes connected distant cultures and religious missions spread across continents, vampire legends began to cross-pollinate, creating new hybrid forms that combined elements from multiple traditions. The vampire legends that would eventually inspire Bram Stoker's Dracula and shape modern vampire fiction contained DNA from all these ancient sources, creating creatures that could speak to universal human fears while reflecting the specific anxieties of their time and place. As we prepare to journey deeper into the forests and villages of Eastern Europe, where vampire beliefs would reach their most developed and influential form, remember that these creatures of the night have been with humanity since our earliest stories. They represent something fundamental in the human experience, a recognition that death is not always final, that the boundary between the living and the dead is more porous than we might wish, and that sometimes the things we fear most are the shadows of what we ourselves might become. From these ancient mythological foundations, vampire legends found their most fertile ground in the mist shrouded valleys and dense forests of Eastern Europe. Here, among the scattered villages of Romania, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Poland, vampire beliefs evolved into their most complex and terrifying forms, becoming an integral part of daily life and shaping the collective consciousness of entire populations for centuries. The landscape itself seemed designed to nurture such dark legends. The Carpathian Mountains rose like the spine of some slumbering giant, their peaks disappearing into perpetual clouds that seemed to swallow the light of day. Ancient forests stretched for hundreds of miles, broken only by small clearings where villages huddled together like islands of humanity in an ocean of darkness. Here, where winter nights could last 18 hours and wolves still howled in the wilderness, the boundary between the natural and supernatural seemed particularly thin. In Romania, the heartland of vampire legend, the creatures were known as strigoi, beings that embodied centuries of accumulated fear and folklore. Romanian vampire beliefs were among the most detailed and sophisticated in Europe, reflecting a culture that had wrestled with these dark spirits for generations. The strigoi were not simply reanimated corpses, but complex supernatural beings with their own hierarchies, motivations, and methods of operation. According to Romanian folklore, there were two distinct types of strigoi. The strigoi zeuts were living vampires, humans who possessed supernatural abilities and could send their souls out of their bodies at night to feed on the life force of others. These living vampires often appeared normal during the day, working as farmers, craftsmen, or merchants. But at night they would enter a trance-like state, while their spiritual essence roamed the countryside seeking victims. The strigoi morti were the undead vampires, those who had died but returned from the grave to continue their existence by feeding on the living. These creatures were created through various circumstances, dying unmarried, being born with a caul, being the seventh child of the same gender in a family, or dying by suicide or violent means. Most dangerously, anyone killed by a strigoi mort would themselves become a vampire, creating the potential for vampiric epidemics that could devastate entire regions. Romanian strigoi possessed abilities that would later become standard elements of vampire lore. They could transform into animals, particularly wolves, bats, or large black dogs. They could control the weather, summoning fog, storms, or supernatural cold to aid in their hunting. They possessed incredible strength, far beyond that of normal humans, and could move with supernatural speed and silence. Perhaps most unsettling of all, Romanian strigoi often returned to their former homes and families, maintaining relationships with the living while secretly feeding on them. A strigoi might appear at the door of their former spouse, claiming to have survived their apparent death, and resume their role as husband or wife, while slowly draining the life from their unsuspecting family members. Children might continue to receive visits from a beloved parent or grandparent, unaware that their visitor was no longer truly alive. The methods for detecting and destroying strigoi were equally elaborate. Villagers would watch for signs of vampiric activity, unexplained deaths, wasting illnesses that struck multiple family members, livestock found drained of blood, or crops withering without apparent cause. Suspected vampire graves could be identified by small holes in the earth, strange lights hovering over burial sites, or the sound of movement from within supposedly sealed coffins. When a strigoi was suspected, the village would gather to perform an exhumation. If the corpse was found to be undecayed, if blood was present around the mouth and nose, or if the body had shifted position within the coffin, these were considered proof of vampiric activity. The destruction of a strigoi required specific rituals. The body must be decapitated with a blessed axe, the heart removed and burned, and the ashes scattered in running water. Only then could the village be certain that the vampire would not return. Moving north into Serbia, vampire beliefs took on their own distinctive characteristics while sharing core elements with Romanian folklore. Serbian vampires were called vampire, a term that would eventually give its name to the entire category of undead creatures. Serbian vampire legends were particularly influential because they were among the first to be documented by educated observers and reported to Western Europe, helping to spread vampire beliefs beyond their original cultural boundaries. Serbian vampires were often created through improper burial practices, or when someone died under particularly violent or disturbing circumstances. The Serbian Orthodox Church played a significant role in vampire folklore, with certain religious violations being considered potential causes of vampirism. A person who died while under excommunication, who had been cursed by a priest, or who had violated sacred oaths might return as a vampire. The Serbian concept of vampirism was closely tied to the idea of spiritual pollution. Vampires were seen as beings who had become corrupted by sin or evil, and their presence could contaminate an entire community. A single vampire could cause crops to fail, livestock to sicken, and plague to spread throughout a region. This made the identification and destruction of vampires a matter of communal survival rather than simply individual protection. Serbian vampire hunters, often village elders or local priests, developed sophisticated methods for tracking and destroying these creatures. They would examine the behavior of horses and dogs, which were believed to be able to sense vampiric presence. A horse that refused to walk over a particular grave, or a dog that howled continuously at night, might be indicating the location of a vampire's resting place. The actual destruction of Serbian vampires required community participation and religious sanction. The village priest would bless the weapons to be used, and the entire community would participate in the exhumation and destruction of the vampire. The body would be pierced with a wooden stake made from ash, hawthorn, or other sacred woods, and the remains would be burned to ensure complete destruction. Bulgarian vampire legends, known as ubur or vampire, shared many elements with their Serbian and Romanian counterparts, but included unique features, reflecting Bulgaria's position at the crossroads of Christian and Islamic cultures. Bulgarian vampires were often described as being able to appear as balls of fire floating over graveyards, a characteristic that may have been influenced by pre-Christian Slavic beliefs about soul lights. The creation of Bulgarian vampires was often attributed to sorcery or to the influence of the devil. People who practiced magic during their lifetime, who made pacts with supernatural entities, or who lived particularly sinful lives were at risk of becoming vampires after death. Bulgarian folklore also included the concept of vampires being created through contagion, with the curse of vampirism being passed from one victim to another like a supernatural disease. Bulgarian methods for dealing with vampires often involved the entire community in elaborate rituals designed to drive the creature away rather than destroy it outright. Villages would create blessed circles around their settlements, using holy water, religious icons, and protective herbs to create barriers that vampires could not cross. Church bells would be rung continuously for days to drive away vampiric influences, and special prayers would be offered to invoke divine protection. In Poland, vampire legends took on characteristics influenced by both Slavic paganism and Catholic Christianity. Polish vampires, known as upior or wampir, were often created when someone died in a state of mortal sin or when proper funeral rites were not observed. The Polish Catholic Church played a significant role in vampire beliefs, with certain religious violations being considered causes of vampirism. Polish vampire legends often emphasize the importance of proper burial practices in preventing vampirism. Bodies had to be buried in consecrated ground, with the correct prayers spoken over them, and with protective items placed in the coffin. Failure to follow these procedures could result in the dead person returning as a vampire. Polish folklore also included the concept of vampires being created through divine punishment, with God allowing the dead to return as vampires to punish communities that had strayed from religious observance. The destruction of Polish vampires often involved church authorities and required religious sanctions. The local priest would examine the evidence for vampiric activity and, if convinced of its reality, would authorize the exhumation and destruction of the suspected vampire. The ritual destruction of Polish vampires was elaborate, involving prayers, holy water, and the use of blessed weapons to ensure that the creature was truly destroyed. Throughout Eastern Europe, vampire beliefs were reinforced by the harsh realities of medieval and then early modern life. High infant mortality rates, frequent epidemics, and the constant threat of violence created conditions where unexplained deaths were common, and fear of the supernatural provided explanations for otherwise inexplicable tragedies. The isolation of rural communities, where a single death could devastate an entire village, made the threat of vampirism particularly terrifying. The seasonal nature of many supposed vampire attacks also reinforced these beliefs. Vampiric activity was often reported during the long, dark months of winter, when food was scarce, diseases spread easily, and the psychological stress of isolation and confinement took its toll on village communities. The timing of these episodes, coinciding with the natural cycle of death and scarcity that characterized winter in pre-industrial Europe, made vampire explanations seem plausible to people desperate for understanding. Eastern European vampire beliefs were also influenced by the region's complex religious history. The Orthodox Christianity of the Balkans, the Catholicism of Poland and Hungary, and the persistent influence of pre-Christian Slavic paganism created a unique religious environment where vampire legends could flourish. Church authorities sometimes endorsed vampire beliefs as explanations for unexplained deaths, while at other times they condemned them as superstition and heresy. The social function of vampire beliefs in Eastern European communities was complex and multifaceted. On one level, they provided explanations for otherwise inexplicable tragedies and gave communities a sense of agency in the face of forces beyond their control. On another level, vampire accusations could be used to settle personal grudges, eliminate social outcasts, or explain away inconvenient deaths. The communal nature of vampire hunting in Eastern Europe also served important social functions. The elaborate rituals required to identify and destroy vampires brought communities together in common purpose, reinforcing social bonds and shared beliefs. The process of investigating vampire claims often involved the entire village in collective decision making, creating a form of participatory justice that helped maintain social cohesion. These Eastern European vampire traditions would prove remarkably resilient, persisting well into the modern era and eventually spreading to Western Europe and beyond through trade, migration, and cultural exchange. The detailed folklore of Romanian strigoi, Serbian vampir, Bulgarian ubor, and Polish upior would provide the foundation for the literary vampires that would capture the imagination of the Western world. The sophistication and complexity of Eastern European vampire beliefs reflected centuries of cultural evolution, during which these legends had been refined and elaborated through countless retellings. Unlike the simpler vampire myths of ancient cultures, Eastern European vampire folklore constituted a complete supernatural ecology, with detailed explanations for how vampires were created, how they behaved, how they could be detected, and how they could be destroyed. As we prepare to journey deeper into the documented cases of vampire hysteria that would eventually bring these Eastern European beliefs to the attention of Western scholars and writers, it is important to understand that these were not simply primitive superstitions, but sophisticated belief systems that served important psychological and social functions for the communities that maintained them. The vampires of Eastern European folklore were complex supernatural beings that embodied the fears, hopes, and wisdom of generations of people who lived in intimate contact with death and the unknown. The mist covered valleys of the Carpathians, the ancient forests of Serbia, and the isolated villages of Poland and Bulgaria had nurtured vampire legends into their most complete and terrifying forms, creating a body of folklore that would eventually give birth to the modern vampire myth and influence popular culture for centuries to come. While Eastern European villages had long whispered tales of vampires in the shadows of their ancient forests, it was not until the early 18th century that these folklore beliefs would collide with the emerging world of Enlightenment scholarship and bureaucratic documentation. The result was one of the most famous and well-documented cases of supposed vampirism in European history, a case that would bridge the gap between medieval superstition and modern investigation, bringing vampire legends to the attention of scholars across the continent. The story begins in the small Serbian village of Medvedija, nestled in the rolling hills south of Belgrade, where the Morava River winds through fertile farmland that had been contested by empires for centuries. This was a frontier region where the Austrian Habsburg Empire met the Ottoman Turkish domains, a place where different cultures, religions, and worldviews intersected in ways that could produce unexpected and sometimes explosive results. In this remote village lived a man named Arnold Paole, known locally as Arnaud Paole, a former soldier who had returned from military service to take up the quiet life of a farmer. Arnold was well regarded by his neighbors, described as a honest and hardworking man who had served with distinction in the Habsburg forces during their campaigns against the Ottoman Empire. He had purchased a small farm in Medvedja and seemed content to live out his days in peaceful obscurity, tending his crops and livestock like countless other veterans who had traded sword for plow. But Arnold Paole carried with him a secret that would eventually transform him from an ordinary farmer into one of history's most famous supposed vampires. During his military service, while stationed in the borderlands between Christian and Muslim territories, Arnold had encountered something that had shaken him to his core. He confided to a few close friends that he had been attacked by a vampire while serving in the region of Kosovo, and that he had been forced to seek out the creature's grave and consume some of the earth mixed with the vampire's blood to break the curse that had been placed upon him. This revelation, shared in hushed tones around evening fires, marked Arnold as a man touched by the supernatural in the eyes of his fellow villagers. In the complex folklore of Serbian vampire beliefs, someone who had been attacked by a vampire remained forever at risk of becoming one themselves, regardless of any protective measures they might have taken. Arnold's admission that he had been forced to perform vampire-related rituals only reinforced the sense that he walked in the shadow of dark forces. For several years, Arnold lived peacefully in Medvedja, working his farm and gradually earning the trust and acceptance of his neighbors, despite the whispered stories about his supernatural encounter. He married a local woman and seemed to be building a normal life, but those who knew him best noticed that he carried himself like a man under a curse, someone who was constantly looking over his shoulder as if expecting something terrible to emerge from the darkness. The end came suddenly and violently in the summer of 1726. While working in his fields during the hay harvest, Arnold fell from a loaded wagon and broke his neck, dying almost instantly from his injuries. It was the kind of accident that could happen to any farmer during the demanding work of bringing in the crops. But in a community already primed to see supernatural forces at work, Arnold's sudden death seemed like the fulfillment of a dark prophecy. Arnold Paole was buried according to Serbian Orthodox customs in the village cemetery, with proper prayers spoken over his grave and protective measures taken to ensure his peaceful rest. For a time, it seemed that the whispered concerns about his supernatural affliction had been groundless, and the village began to return to its normal rhythms of agricultural life. But within 30 days of Arnold's burial, the peaceful village of Medvedja was gripped by terror. 4 people died under mysterious circumstances, all claiming before their deaths that they had been visited by Arnold Paole, who appeared to them as a horrifying apparition that drained their strength and life force. The victims described seeing Arnold exactly as he had appeared in life, but with pale skin, glowing eyes, and an aura of menace that filled them with paralyzing fear. The deaths followed a pattern that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with vampire folklore. The victims first complained of nightmares in which Arnold appeared to them, followed by a gradual wasting away as their strength seemed to drain from their bodies. They reported feeling constantly cold, losing their appetite, and experiencing a growing sense of dread that seemed to emanate from the very air around them. Within days or weeks of the initial visitation, they would die, often crying out in their final moments that Arnold had come for them. The village elders, faced with what appeared to be a classic case of vampiric activity, decided that action must be taken to end the supernatural attacks. 40 days after Arnold's original burial, a party of villagers, led by the local priest and village elder, gathered at his grave to perform the traditional ritual of vampire destruction. What they found when they opened Arnold's coffin would be recorded in official documents and reported throughout the Austrian Empire, making this one of the first vampire cases to receive detailed bureaucratic documentation. According to the eyewitness accounts recorded by Austrian officials, Arnold's body showed all the classic signs of vampirism as understood by Serbian folklore. The corpse appeared remarkably well preserved, with no signs of normal decomposition despite having been buried for over a month. Fresh blood was visible around the mouth and nose, and the fingernails and hair appeared to have continued growing after death. Most disturbing of all, the body seemed to have shifted position within the coffin, suggesting that the dead man had been moving and stirring in his grave. The assembled villagers, convinced that they were faced with an authentic vampire, performed the traditional ritual of destruction. Arnold's body was pierced with a wooden stake, and witnesses reported that a great quantity of fresh blood flowed from the wound, accompanied by what they described as a groaning sound that seemed to come from the corpse itself. The head was then severed from the body, and both the corpse and the coffin were burned completely, with the ashes scattered in running water to prevent any possibility of the vampire's return. The destruction of Arnold Paole seemed to bring peace to Medvedja, and for several years the village returned to normal life. The 4 people who had died following Arnold's death were also exhumed and destroyed according to vampire protocols, and no further supernatural incidents were reported. The case might have remained a purely local matter, remembered only in village folklore, if not for a second outbreak of mysterious deaths that occurred 5 years later. In 1731, Medvedja was again struck by a wave of unexplained deaths, with 17 people dying within a few months under circumstances that bore all the hallmarks of vampiric attack. The victims reported the same symptoms as before: nightmares, wasting illness, and the sensation of being drained of life force by supernatural visitors. But this time, the supposed vampires were not limited to Arnold Paole alone, but included several of the people who had died during the first outbreak. The second vampire epidemic in Medvedja coincided with increased Austrian administrative control over the region, and the local Habsburg officials found themselves dealing with what their Serbian subjects insisted was a supernatural crisis requiring immediate intervention. The Austrian authorities, trained in Enlightenment rationalism and bureaucratic procedure, were skeptical of vampire claims, but could not ignore the very real deaths that were occurring in the village. The Habsburg government dispatched a military surgeon named Johannes Fluckner, along with other medical and military personnel, to investigate the situation in Medvedja and provide an official report on the alleged vampire activity. Fluckinger's mission was to apply scientific observation and medical knowledge to determine whether there was any rational explanation for the deaths and the reported vampire phenomena. What Fluckinger found in Medvegia challenged his rational worldview and forced him to document phenomena that seemed to defy scientific explanation. Working with local Serbian Orthodox priests and village elders, Fluckinger supervised the exhumation of 12 suspected vampires, including several from the original Arnold Paole outbreak and additional victims from the more recent epidemic. Fluckinger's official report, written in formal German bureaucratic style and submitted to his superiors in Belgrade and Vienna, described in clinical detail the condition of the exhumed bodies. Like Arnold Paole before them, many of the corpses showed signs that seemed to contradict normal decomposition processes. Some bodies appeared remarkably well preserved, despite having been buried for months, while others showed what Fluckinger described as evidence of continued life activity after death. The most disturbing case documented by Fluckinger was that of a woman named Melissa, who had died during the second outbreak and was suspected of being a vampire. When her coffin was opened, Fluckinger reported finding the body in a state of perfect preservation, with what appeared to be fresh blood around the mouth and evidence that the hair and fingernails had continued growing after burial. Most unsettling of all, when the body was pierced with a stake, Fluckinger observed what he described as a significant flow of fresh blood, far more than should have been possible in a corpse that had been buried for several weeks. Fluckinger's report, known as the Visum et Repertum, or official examination and report, was filed with Austrian authorities and eventually found its way to libraries and scholarly institutions throughout Europe. The document was significant because it represented one of the first attempts to apply systematic observation and official documentation to alleged vampire phenomena, creating a bridge between traditional folklore beliefs and emerging scientific methodology. The Fluckinger report was particularly influential because it was written by an educated medical professional rather than by local villagers or religious authorities. While Fluckinger remained skeptical of supernatural explanations for what he observed, he was forced to acknowledge that he had witnessed phenomena that could not be easily explained by the medical knowledge of his time. His careful documentation of physical evidence lent credibility to vampire beliefs and helped spread awareness of Serbian vampire folklore throughout educated European society. The Arnold Paole case and the subsequent Medvegia vampire epidemic had far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond the borders of a small Serbian village. The official documentation of these events provided source material that would be studied by scholars, writers, and philosophers throughout the 18th century, contributing to a growing European fascination with vampire phenomena that would eventually culminate in the literary vampire traditions of the 19th century. The case also highlighted the cultural tensions between traditional folklore beliefs and emerging Enlightenment rationalism. Austrian officials found themselves caught between their commitment to scientific observation and the undeniable reality that their Serbian subjects were experiencing phenomena that seemed to validate centuries-old vampire beliefs. The careful documentation of the Medvegia cases represented an attempt to bridge this gap, applying systematic investigation to supernatural claims while remaining open to the possibility that traditional beliefs might contain kernels of truth. For the villagers of Medvegia, The Arnold Paole case and its aftermath reinforced their traditional understanding of vampire phenomena while demonstrating that these beliefs could withstand scrutiny from educated outsiders. The fact that Austrian officials had been forced to acknowledge the reality of at least some aspects of vampire activity provided validation for Serbian folklore traditions and helped ensure their continued transmission to future generations. The influence of the Arnold Paole case extended throughout European intellectual circles, inspiring debates about the nature of death, decomposition, and the possibility of supernatural survival after bodily death. Enlightenment philosophers used the case as a lens through which to examine questions about empirical observation, the reliability of witness testimony, and the relationship between scientific knowledge and traditional beliefs. As the 18th century progressed, the Arnold Paole case would be cited in scholarly treatises, philosophical essays, and literary works as evidence for or against the reality of vampire phenomena. The case had succeeded in bringing vampire beliefs from the realm of village folklore into the world of educated discourse, setting the stage for the literary transformation of vampire legends that would define the next century of vampire development. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the boundary between sleep and waking grows thin, the story of Arnold Paole reminds us that the line between folklore and reality, between superstition and documentation, is more complex than we might assume. In a small Serbian village, the collision between ancient beliefs and modern investigation produced a mystery that continues to intrigue us centuries later. A reminder that some questions about the nature of life and death remain unanswered despite all our advances in knowledge and understanding. As the documented cases of vampire hysteria spread through European intellectual circles, transforming folklore into subjects of scholarly debate, the stage was set for a remarkable transformation in how these creatures of the night would be understood and portrayed. The transition from peasant superstition to literary sophistication would take place not in the remote villages of Eastern Europe, but in the elegant drawing rooms and libraries of Romantic era intellectuals, where vampire legends would be reimagined as vehicles for exploring the darkest aspects of human nature and desire. The year 1816 marked a pivotal moment in the evolution of vampire literature, though few of those involved could have anticipated the profound influence their summer gathering would have on the future of horror fiction. The setting was Villa Diodati, an elegant lakeside mansion on the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland, where one of the most famous house parties in literary history was about to unfold. The host was Lord Byron, already established as one of Europe's most celebrated and scandalous poets. George Gordon Byron, the sixth Baron Byron, had achieved fame not only for his literary genius, but for his reputation as a libertine, a man whose romantic entanglements and unconventional lifestyle had made him a figure of both fascination and condemnation in polite society. His dark good looks, his aristocratic bearing, and his aura of barely controlled passion had made him the embodiment of the romantic ideal, a living representation of the brooding, mysterious hero who would soon become central to vampire literature. Byron had fled England under a cloud of scandal, leaving behind whispers of incest, sodomy, and other unmentionable vices that had made his continued presence in British society impossible. Switzerland offered him refuge from the moral condemnation of his homeland, and Villa Diodati provided the perfect setting for a summer of intellectual and creative exploration far from the disapproving eyes of conventional society. Joining Byron at the villa was Percy Bysshe Shelley, another poet whose radical political views and unconventional lifestyle had marked him as a dangerous figure in the eyes of the establishment. Shelley brought with him his 19-year-old companion, Mary Godwin, daughter of the feminist philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft and the political theorist William Godwin. Though Mary would not marry Shelley until later that year, their relationship was already the subject of considerable scandal, as Shelley had abandoned his pregnant wife to pursue his passion for the brilliant young woman who would become Mary Shelley. The party was completed by Claire Claremont, Mary's stepsister, who had recently become pregnant by Byron and was desperately hoping to rekindle their affair. Also present was John William Polidori, Byron's personal physician, a young man of Italian descent who harbored literary ambitions of his own and watched the proceedings with the careful eye of someone who hoped to transform observation into artistic creation. The summer of 1816 was memorable for more than just the illustrious company gathered at Villa Diodati. The year had been marked by extraordinary weather phenomena caused by the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia the previous year, which had thrown massive amounts of volcanic ash into the atmosphere and caused what historians would later call the year without a summer. Across Europe and North America, temperatures remained abnormally cold, crops failed, and an oppressive gloom seemed to settle over the landscape like a physical manifestation of melancholy. At Villa Diodati, the unseasonably cold and stormy weather kept the party indoors for much of their stay, creating an atmosphere that was perfectly suited to the exploration of dark and supernatural themes. The group spent their evenings in intense conversation about literature, philosophy, science, and the occult, with Byron serving as the magnetic center around which the others orbited, like planets around a dark sun. It was during one of these storm-bound evenings that Byron proposed the challenge that would change literary history. The group had been reading aloud from a collection of German ghost stories, and Byron suggested that each member of the party should attempt to write their own supernatural tale. The challenge was accepted with enthusiasm, and what followed would produce two of the most influential works of horror fiction ever written. Mary Shelley, inspired by the scientific discussions she had heard between Byron and Shelley about the possibility of reanimating dead tissue, began work on what would become Frankenstein, a novel that would establish many of the fundamental themes of science fiction while exploring the consequences of humanity's attempts to transcend natural limitations. Her creation would become one of the defining monsters of modern literature, but for our purposes, it is the other work produced during that famous summer that demands our attention. John Polidori, the young physician who observed the proceedings with such careful attention, was working on his own contribution to the challenge. Initially, Polidori had planned to expand upon a fragment that Byron himself had begun, a mysterious tale of a traveler who encounters a strange nobleman with supernatural powers. But as Polidori developed the story, it became something entirely his own, a work that would transform vampire literature and establish the template for virtually every vampire story that would follow. Polidori's tale eventually published as The Vampire in 1819, introduced the world to Lord Ruthven, a character who was unmistakably based on Byron himself. Ruthven possessed all of Byron's charismatic appeal and aristocratic bearing, but these qualities were revealed to mask a supernatural predator who used his charm and social position to lure victims to their doom. For the first time in literary history, the vampire was not a shambling corpse or a demonic apparition, but a sophisticated aristocrat who moved through the highest levels of society, using seduction rather than brute force to achieve his dark purposes. The character of Lord Ruthven represented a revolutionary departure from traditional vampire folklore. Where Eastern European vampires had been grotesque revenants that inspired immediate revulsion, Ruthven was attractive, intelligent, and socially adept. He attended the opera, moved in fashionable circles, and possessed all the qualities that made him irresistible to both men and women. His vampirism was not immediately apparent, but was revealed gradually through the course of the story, making him a far more dangerous and psychologically complex predator than his folkloric predecessors. Polidori's vampire embodied many of the key themes of romantic literature, particularly the fascination with the figure of the Byronic hero, a character type defined by aristocratic bearing, magnetic personality, and a mysterious past that hinted at dark secrets and forbidden knowledge. The Byronic hero was typically a figure of both attraction and repulsion, possessing qualities that made him irresistible while simultaneously representing a threat to conventional morality and social order. The connection between Byron and the vampire was more than literary coincidence, as Byron's own life and personality had made him a figure of both fascination and fear in European society, a man whose aristocratic privilege allowed him to indulge appetites and behaviors that would have destroyed someone of lesser social standing. His reputation for sexual excess, his rumored involvement in occult practices, and his apparent immunity to conventional moral constraints made him seem almost supernatural in his ability to transcend normal human limitations. Byron's personal magnetism was legendary among those who knew him. Women were drawn to him with an intensity that seemed to defy rational explanation, often destroying their own lives and reputations in pursuit of his attention. Men were equally fascinated, finding in Byron a figure who embodied their own secret desires for freedom from social constraint and moral limitation. This ability to inspire both devotion and destruction in others made Byron a perfect model for the literary vampire, a creature who used supernatural charisma to bend others to his will. The Vampire was initially published anonymously, and many readers assumed it was the work of Byron himself, an assumption that Byron did little to discourage. The attribution to Byron gave the work additional notoriety and helped establish the connection between the famous poet and vampire literature that would persist throughout the Romantic period and beyond. The success of The Vampire established the aristocratic vampire as a dominant figure in 19th century literature and laid the groundwork for countless imitations and variations. The story was adapted for the stage multiple times, with theatrical productions in London, Paris, and other European capitals drawing enthusiastic audiences who were fascinated by the combination of aristocratic glamour and supernatural terror. The influence of Polidori's work extended far beyond literature into the broader cultural understanding of vampirism. The aristocratic vampire became a metaphor for the way that social privilege could be used to prey upon the less powerful, while the vampire's supernatural abilities represented the seemingly limitless capacity of the wealthy and powerful to transcend normal human constraints and consequences. The romantic vampire also represented a significant shift in how supernatural evil was understood and portrayed. Traditional vampires had been external threats, demonic forces that attacked human communities from outside. The aristocratic vampire, by contrast, was an internal threat, a predator who used his position within society to prey upon it from within. This made the romantic vampire a far more psychologically complex and socially relevant figure than his folkloric predecessors. Byron himself seemed to embrace his association with vampire literature, cultivating an image that played upon the connection between aristocratic privilege and supernatural power. His continued romantic scandals, his fascination with the occult, and his apparent immunity to social consequences all contributed to a public persona that seemed to blur the line between human libertine and supernatural predator. The transformation of the vampire from folkloric monster to romantic anti-hero represented more than just a literary evolution. It reflected broader changes in European society and culture during the early 19th century. The aristocratic vampire embodied anxieties about social inequality, the abuse of power, and the way that privilege could be used to exploit and destroy others while maintaining a veneer of respectability and charm. The romantic vampire also reflected changing attitudes towards sexuality and desire. Where traditional vampires had been associated with disease, death, and corruption, the aristocratic vampire was explicitly connected with sexual attraction and seduction. This made vampirism a metaphor for the dangerous allure of forbidden desire and the way that passion could lead to destruction. The influence of the Villa Diodati gathering extended far beyond the immediate works it produced. The connections forged during that famous summer, the ideas explored in those storm-bound conversations, and the creative challenges undertaken by the participants established vampire literature as a legitimate subject for serious artistic exploration. The aristocratic vampire created by Polidori would influence writers throughout the 19th century, from James Malcolm Rymer's of Varney the Vampire to Joseph Sheridan, Le Fanu's Carmilla to Bram Stoker's Count Dracula. The romantic transformation of vampire literature also established many of the conventions that continue to define vampire fiction today. The idea of the vampire as a charismatic aristocrat, the connection between vampirism and sexual desire, the vampire's ability to move undetected through human society, and the complex psychological relationship between vampire and victim all trace their origins to the work produced during that remarkable summer at Villa Diodati. As the candles burned low in the elegant rooms of the lakeside villa, and the storm winds swept across Lake Geneva, the small group of writers gathered there could hardly have imagined that their creative experiments would transform one of humanity's oldest supernatural fears into one of literature's most enduring and influential character types. The vampire had emerged from the myths of Eastern European folklore to take its place in the drawing rooms of sophisticated society, forever changed from a creature of pure terror into a figure of dark glamour and forbidden attraction. The legacy of that famous summer would continue to influence vampire literature for centuries to come, establishing the foundation upon which all subsequent vampire fiction would build. In transforming the vampire from monster to anti-hero, the Romantic writers had created a new kind of supernatural being, one that reflected the complexities and contradictions of human nature itself, forever blurring the line between evil and attraction, death and desire, monster and man. From the aristocratic salons where Polidori's Lord Ruthven first stalked his prey, vampire literature continued to evolve throughout the 19th century, spawning countless variations and refinements of the romantic vampire archetype. Yet none of these literary experiments, however influential in their time, would achieve the lasting impact of a novel published in 1897 by an Irish theater manager whose name would become forever linked with the most famous vampire in literary history. Abraham Stoker, known to his friends as Bram, was born in Dublin on November the 8th, 1847, into a middle-class Protestant family that valued education, hard work, and respectability. His early years were marked by a mysterious illness that kept him bedridden for much of his childhood, a period of enforced inactivity that may have contributed to his lifelong fascination with stories of the supernatural and macabre. During these long months of confinement, young Bram was entertained by his mother Charlotte with Irish folk tales filled with banshees, fairies, and other supernatural beings that would later influence his literary imagination. As Bram recovered his health and grew into a tall, robust young man, he seemed to embrace physical activity with the enthusiasm of someone making up for lost time. At Trinity College Dublin, he excelled at athletics, becoming university champion in both wrestling and weightlifting, while also demonstrating considerable academic ability and a talent for debate. This combination of physical vigor and intellectual curiosity would later inform his creation of characters who could match supernatural monsters through both strength and knowledge. After graduation, Stoker followed a conventional path into the Irish civil service, working as a clerk in Dublin Castle while pursuing his real passion as an unpaid drama critic for local newspapers. His reviews caught the attention of Henry Irving, one of London's most celebrated actors, who invited the young Irishman to join him as business manager of the prestigious Lyceum Theatre. In 1878, Stoker moved to London to begin what would become a 27-year association with Irving and the Lyceum, a relationship that would profoundly influence his understanding of theatrical performance, dramatic structure, and the power of charismatic personality. Henry Irving was more than just an employer to Stoker. He became a mentor, friend, and quite possibly the primary inspiration for Count Dracula himself. Irving was a man of magnetic presence and commanding personality, capable of dominating any room he entered and bending others to his will through sheer force of charisma. His performances on stage were legendary for their intensity and psychological complexity, and his private life was marked by the same dramatic flair that characterized his professional work. Irving's influence on Stoker extended beyond the professional realm into the personal and creative spheres. The actor's aristocratic bearing, his penetrating gaze, his carefully cultivated air of mystery, and his ability to inspire both devotion and fear in those around him would all find their way into Stoker's portrayal of Count Dracula. Even Irving's physical appearance, with his tall, thin frame, prominent nose, and piercing dark eyes, would be reflected in Stoker's description of his vampire antagonist. The idea for Dracula began to take shape in Stoker's mind during the 1880s as he combined his growing knowledge of vampire folklore with his theatrical understanding of dramatic structure and character development. The catalyst for the novel's creation may have been a nightmare that Stoker experienced after eating a particularly rich meal, a dream in which he envisioned a vampire king rising from his tomb to wreak havoc upon the living world. This nightmarish vision provided the emotional core around which Stoker would build his masterpiece. But Stoker was not content to rely solely on inspiration and imagination for his vampire novel. He approached the project with the methodical thoroughness of a scholar, spending years researching vampire folklore, Eastern European history, and the geographical details of Transylvania. His research notes, which survive to this day, reveal the painstaking care with which he constructed the world of his novel, drawing upon sources ranging from medieval chronicles to contemporary travel accounts. One of the most important influences on Stoker's research was his friendship with Arminius Vambéry, a Hungarian scholar and adventurer who had spent years traveling through Eastern Europe and the Ottoman Empire. Vambéry regaled Stoker with stories of the historical Vlad the Impaler, the 15th century Wallachian prince whose cruelty had made him a legend throughout the region. From Vambéry, Stoker learned details about Vlad's life, his methods of rule, and the folklore that had grown up around his memory, information that would prove crucial in transforming a historical figure into a supernatural monster. Stoker's research extended beyond folklore and history to encompass the latest developments in science and technology. The novel reflected contemporary fascination with developments in medicine, psychology, and communication technology, incorporating elements such as blood transfusion, hypnotism, and the phonograph into its narrative structure. This combination of ancient, supernatural beliefs with modern scientific knowledge gave Dracula a unique resonance that helped explain its immediate popularity and lasting influence. The character of Count Dracula that emerged from Stoker's research and imagination represented a synthesis of all the vampire traditions that had preceded him, combined with innovations that would define vampire literature for generations to come. Dracula possessed the aristocratic bearing and charismatic appeal of Polidori's Lord Ruthven, the folkloric powers and weaknesses of Eastern European vampire legends, and a psychological complexity that reflected the influence of emerging theories about the human mind and unconscious desires. Stoker's Dracula was simultaneously ancient and modern, a creature whose origins stretched back to the medieval past, but whose methods and motivations reflected contemporary anxieties about technology, immigration, and social change. The Count was portrayed as both a relic of feudal barbarism and a forward-thinking predator who understood how to exploit the interconnected nature of modern civilization to spread his influence across vast distances. The novel's structure reflected Stoker's theatrical background, with carefully orchestrated scenes of mounting tension, dramatic revelations, and climactic confrontations that built toward a satisfying resolution. The story was told through a collage of documents, including diary entries, letters, newspaper clippings, and phonograph recordings, a technique that gave the narrative a sense of authenticity while allowing Stoker to present multiple perspectives on the supernatural events he was describing. The publication of Dracula in 1897 was initially met with mixed reviews, with some critics praising its originality and dramatic power, while others condemned it as sensationalist and morally questionable. Victorian society was uncomfortable with the novel's explicit treatment of sexual themes, its portrayal of predatory masculine power, and its suggestion that the boundaries between civilization and savagery were more fragile than most people cared to admit. Despite the mixed critical reception, Dracula quickly found an enthusiastic popular audience, particularly among readers who were drawn to its combination of supernatural thrills and psychological complexity. The novel tapped into deep-seated fears about foreign influence, sexual predation, and the vulnerability of modern civilization to ancient forms of evil, themes that resonated powerfully with readers living through a period of rapid social and technological change. The character of Count Dracula himself became an immediate cultural icon, embodying a new kind of supernatural villain who was simultaneously repulsive and attractive, ancient and modern, foreign and familiar. Dracula's aristocratic bearing and supernatural powers made him a figure of dark glamour, while his predatory nature and association with death and corruption ensured that he remained genuinely frightening rather than merely romantic. Stoker's portrayal of Dracula established many of the characteristics that would become standard elements of vampire fiction. The vampire's aversion to sunlight, his inability to cross running water, his need to rest in his native soil, his vulnerability to religious symbols, and his ability to transform into animal shapes. These elements, drawn from various folklore traditions and combined with Stoker's own innovations, created a comprehensive mythology that would influence virtually every subsequent vampire story. The novel's treatment of the relationship between vampire and victim was particularly influential, exploring themes of seduction, domination, and psychological corruption that would become central to vampire literature. Stoker's vampires did not simply drain their victims' blood, they corrupted their souls, turning them into willing participants in their own destruction and eventual transformation into creatures of the night. The supporting characters in Dracula were equally important in establishing templates for vampire fiction. Van Helsing, the scholar warrior who combines scientific knowledge with folk wisdom in his battle against the supernatural, became the prototype for countless vampire hunters. Mina Harker, the intelligent and resourceful woman who maintains her humanity despite becoming partially infected by vampiric influence, established the template for the strong female character who serves as both victim and hero in vampire stories. The influence of Dracula extended far beyond literature into theater, film, and popular culture generally. The novel was adapted for the stage during Stoker's lifetime, with productions in London and elsewhere bringing the Count to vivid theatrical life. These stage adaptations helped establish the visual iconography of Dracula, including his distinctive evening dress, dramatic cape, and commanding presence that would later influence film portrayals. The transition of Dracula from literature to film began in the early 20th century and reached its most influential form in the 1931 Universal Pictures film starring Bela Lugosi. Lugosi's portrayal, with its distinctive accent, hypnotic gaze, and theatrical mannerisms, became the definitive image of Dracula for generations of audiences and established many of the visual and vocal characteristics that continue to define the character today. Stoker's creation had succeeded in transforming vampire literature from a primarily European phenomenon into a global cultural force. The novel's combination of folkloric authenticity, psychological complexity, and dramatic power created a work that transcended its immediate historical context to become a timeless exploration of themes that continue to resonate with contemporary audiences. The lasting appeal of Dracula lies not just in its effective use of supernatural terror, but in its sophisticated exploration of fundamental human fears and desires. The novel addressed anxieties about sexuality, power, death, and the fragility of civilization that remain relevant to readers more than a century after its initial publication. Dracula became a lens through which successive generations could examine their own fears and fascinations, adapting the basic story to reflect changing social concerns and cultural preoccupations. Stoker's masterpiece also established vampire fiction as a legitimate literary genre, demonstrating that supernatural themes could be used to explore serious, psychological, and social issues rather than simply providing cheap thrills. The novel's influence can be traced through virtually every subsequent work of vampire fiction, from the sympathetic vampires of Anne Rice to the teenage vampires of contemporary young adult fiction. The character of Count Dracula has proven remarkably adaptable, serving as a vehicle for exploring themes ranging from immigrant anxiety to sexual liberation to environmental destruction. Each generation has found new meanings in Stoker's creation, ensuring that the Count remains a vital and relevant figure in popular culture more than a century after his first appearance. As we drift toward the quieter hours of night, when shadows lengthen and the familiar world takes on mysterious qualities, we can appreciate how Bram Stoker succeeded in creating not just a memorable character, but an enduring myth that continues to evolve and adapt to reflect our changing fears and fascinations. In the figure of Count Dracula, Stoker gave us a mirror in which we can see reflected both our darkest impulses and our capacity for heroic resistance to the forces that would corrupt and destroy us. While Bram Stoker's Dracula was establishing the vampire as a figure of global cultural significance, scholars and anthropologists were beginning to document vampire like creatures in cultures far removed from the castles and villages of Eastern Europe. These discoveries revealed that the human fascination with blood-drinking supernatural beings was not limited to any single region or tradition, but represented a truly universal aspect of human folklore that had emerged independently in societies separated by vast distances and centuries of time. The universality of vampire legends suggests something fundamental about human psychology and the way we process fears about death, disease, and the unknown. From the steaming jungles of Southeast Asia to the windswept plateaus of Tibet, from the arid deserts of Mexico to the frozen tundra of Alaska, cultures that had no contact with European vampire traditions had developed their own versions of creatures that fed upon human life force, each reflecting the unique environmental and cultural conditions of their origins. In the mountainous regions of the Philippines, among the Tagalog and Visayan peoples, stories were told of the aswang, shape-shifting creatures that combined characteristics of vampire, witch, and werewolf. The aswang were particularly feared because of their ability to take on multiple forms, appearing sometimes as ordinary humans, sometimes as large black dogs, and sometimes as giant birds with razor-sharp talons. During the day, an aswang might work alongside its neighbors as a farmer or craftsperson, but when darkness fell, it would transform into its true nature and hunt for victims. The feeding habits of the aswang were particularly disturbing to the communities that believed in them. These creatures were said to prefer the blood of unborn children, using their long, thin tongues to penetrate the bodies of pregnant women and drain the life from developing babies. The aswang could also consume the hearts and livers of sleeping adults, leaving their victims to waste away over a period of days or weeks, never knowing what had befallen them. Filipino vampire legends included elaborate methods for detecting and protecting against aswang attacks. Pregnant women would sleep with scissors or knives placed on their bellies to cut the creature's proboscis like tongue. Garlic, salt, and holy water were used to create protective barriers, while certain plants and herbs were believed to repel aswang influence. The creatures were said to be particularly vulnerable during the day when they resumed human form and could be killed by conventional weapons if their true nature was discovered. Moving westward across the Pacific, we encounter entirely different vampire traditions in the highlands of Tibet, where the harsh environment and unique Buddhist culture gave rise to legends of creatures called rolangs, or walking corpses. These beings were created when a person died under particularly traumatic circumstances, or when proper funeral rites were not observed according to Tibetan Buddhist traditions. Rolangs were described as reanimated corpses that retained some of their human intelligence, but were driven by an insatiable hunger for human flesh and blood. Unlike many other vampire traditions, Tibetan rolangs were not necessarily malevolent by choice, but were seen as trapped souls unable to progress through the normal cycle of death and rebirth. This Buddhist interpretation gave Tibetan vampire legends a distinctly different moral character, emphasizing compassion for the vampire as much as fear of its actions. The creation and destruction of rolangs was closely tied to Tibetan Buddhist religious practices. Lamas, or Buddhist monks, were considered experts in dealing with these creatures, using specialized mantras, ritual implements, and blessed substances to either destroy the rolang or help its trapped soul find peace. The complex relationship between vampire legends and religious doctrine in Tibetan culture demonstrated how supernatural beliefs could be integrated into sophisticated theological systems. In the vast expanse of the Australian outback, Aboriginal peoples developed their own traditions of blood-drinking supernatural beings that reflected the unique challenges of survival in one of the world's harshest environments. The Yaramai Hahu was described as a small, red-skinned creature with suckers on its hands and feet, resembling a cross between a vampire and a tiny humanoid. According to Aboriginal legends, the Yaramai Hahu would hide in fig trees and drop down upon unsuspecting travelers, attaching itself to their bodies and draining their blood through the suckers on its extremities. After feeding, the creature would swallow its victim whole, then regurgitate them later in a partially digested state. Remarkably, victims of this process would survive, but would be permanently changed, becoming shorter and more red-skinned with each encounter, eventually transforming into Yaramai Hahu themselves. This transformation mythology reflected Aboriginal understanding of the relationship between predator and prey, the cyclical nature of life and death, and the way that survival in the harsh Australian environment required constant adaptation and change. The Yaramayahu legends served as cautionary tales about the dangers of traveling alone in unfamiliar territory, while also providing explanations for the physical and behavioral differences observed among different Aboriginal groups. Across the Pacific Ocean, in the mountains and valleys of Mexico, indigenous peoples developed their own rich traditions of vampiric creatures that reflected the complex religious and cultural heritage of Mesoamerican civilization. The Tlahuelpuchi were shape shifting witches believed to be born with their supernatural abilities, destined from birth to feed upon human blood to survive. Unlike European vampires, who were created through death and in transformation, Mexican Tlahuelpuchi were living humans who possess supernatural powers from birth. They were said to be born with distinctive physical characteristics, including unusual eye color and the ability to transform into animals, particularly turkeys, buzzards, and other birds associated with death and carrion. The Tlahuelpuchi were particularly feared because they appeared completely normal during daylight hours and could live for decades among their neighbors without detection. The feeding patterns of Tlahuelpuchi reflected the social structures and concerns of Mexican indigenous communities. These creatures were said to prefer the blood of infants and small children, requiring regular feeding to maintain their human appearance and supernatural abilities. Families would take elaborate precautions to protect their children, using combinations of Catholic religious symbols and pre Columbian protective rituals that reflected the complex religious syncretism of colonial and post colonial Mexico. In the rainforests of Brazil, among the indigenous peoples of the Amazon basin, vampire legends took on characteristics that reflected the unique biodiversity and environmental challenges of the world's largest tropical forest. The boto, or pink river dolphin, was believed to be a shape shifting creature that could take human form to seduce women and drain their life force through sexual encounters. According to Brazilian folklore, the boto would emerge from the river at night transformed into a handsome young man wearing white clothing and a hat to conceal the breathing hole that remained on top of his head. The boto would attend village festivals and dances, using supernatural charisma to seduce young women who would be found the next morning drained of life and sometimes pregnant with hybrid offspring that would never fully develop. The Boto legends reflected indigenous understanding of the complex relationship between humans and the natural world in the Amazon, where the boundary between the human and animal realms was seen as permeable and constantly shifting. These stories also served practical functions, providing explanations for unexplained pregnancies and deaths while reinforcing social norms about sexual behavior and community protection. Moving north into the Caribbean, African influenced vampire traditions emerged from the complex cultural mixing that occurred during the colonial period. The Sukuyon of Trinidad and other Caribbean islands was described as an old woman who could shed her skin at night and transform into a ball of fire that would fly through the darkness seeking victims. The Sukuyon would enter homes through the smallest cracks and openings, resuming human form to feed upon sleeping victims by sucking their blood through tiny wounds that left little trace. Like her African ancestors, the Sukuyon was vulnerable during the day when she had to return to her shed skin and could be destroyed by finding and salting the discarded skin or by scattering rice around the home, which she would be compelled to count grain by grain until sunrise trapped her in her vulnerable state. These Caribbean vampire legends reflected the complex cultural heritage of island populations that combined African spiritual traditions with European folklore and indigenous beliefs. The Sukuyon served as both a figure of terror and a symbol of female power in societies where women often faced significant social restrictions and economic hardships. In the frozen landscapes of Alaska and northern Canada, Inuit peoples developed their own traditions of blood drinking supernatural beings that reflected the unique challenges of survival in the Arctic environment. The Wendigo was described as a cannibalistic creature created when humans resorted to eating human flesh during times of extreme famine and desperation. According to Inuit legend, the Wendigo was once human but had been transformed by the act of cannibalism into a creature of immense size and strength with yellowed fangs, sunken eyes, and an insatiable hunger for human flesh and blood. The Wendigo represented the ultimate violation of cultural taboos and the loss of humanity that could result from the extreme survival pressures of Arctic life. The psychological aspects of Wendigo legends were particularly sophisticated, recognizing what modern psychology would term the traumatic effects of extreme isolation, starvation, and moral compromise. The creature served as both a cautionary tale about the consequences of violating cultural norms and a way of understanding and processing the psychological trauma that could result from survival in extreme conditions. In the deserts of the American Southwest, Native American tribes developed legends of creatures that shared characteristics with both vampires and skinwalkers. These beings were described as humans who had gained supernatural powers through forbidden rituals and used these abilities to prey upon their own communities. The Navajo tradition of skinwalkers, or Yinaldlushi, included individuals who could transform into animals and possessed abilities that included draining the life force from their victims. These creatures were particularly feared because they were former members of the community who had chosen to embrace dark powers, making them internal threats rather than external enemies. The universal presence of vampire-like creatures in human folklore suggests that these legends serve important psychological and social functions that transcend cultural boundaries. Whether appearing as the aristocratic Dracula of European literature, the shape-shifting Aswang of the Philippines, or the cannibalistic Wendigo of the Arctic, those creatures embody fundamental human fears about death, disease, social betrayal, and the thin line that separates civilization from savagery. The diversity of vampire legends also reflects the way that universal fears are filtered through specific cultural lenses, taking on characteristics that reflect local environmental conditions, social structures, and religious beliefs. The blood-drinking river dolphins of the Amazon, the fireball witches of the Caribbean, and the corpse walkers of Tibet all serve similar psychological functions while reflecting the unique concerns and worldviews of their respective cultures. Perhaps most significantly, the global prevalence of vampire legends suggests that the fear of predatory supernatural beings represents a fundamental aspect of human consciousness, a recognition that the world contains forces that seek to drain our life energy and corrupt our essential humanity. These legends provide frameworks for understanding and confronting these fears, while also serving as cautionary tales about the consequences of violating cultural norms and moral boundaries. As the night deepens and consciousness begins to drift toward the realm of dreams, we can appreciate how vampire legends serve as a bridge between the rational world of daylight and the mysterious realm of sleep, where ancient fears and primal anxieties continue to shape our understanding of what it means to be human in a world filled with both wonder and terror. As we have journeyed across continents and through centuries of vampire folklore, exploring the rich tapestry of legends that have emerged from human imagination and cultural tradition, we arrive at perhaps the most intriguing question of all. Could there be rational, scientific explanations for the phenomena that gave birth to these enduring myths? Modern medicine and psychology have identified a number of conditions and circumstances that might have contributed to vampire beliefs, offering fascinating insights into how real medical conditions could have been misinterpreted as supernatural occurrences by people lacking access to scientific knowledge. The intersection between medical reality and supernatural belief reveals itself most dramatically in the study of porphyria, a group of rare genetic disorders that affect the production of heme, the iron containing part of hemoglobin that gives blood its red color. Individuals suffering from certain forms of porphyria experience symptoms that bear an uncanny resemblance to the characteristics traditionally attributed to vampires, creating a compelling case for how a real medical condition might have influenced the development of vampire folklore. Acute intermittent porphyria and other forms of this condition can cause extreme sensitivity to sunlight, with exposure to ultraviolet radiation triggering painful skin reactions, blistering and scarring that could transform a person's appearance dramatically. Patients often develop a preference for darkness, avoiding daylight hours and becoming primarily active during the evening and night, a behavioral pattern that would have seemed deeply suspicious to communities where normal life followed the rhythm of sunrise and sunset. The facial changes associated with severe porphyria can be particularly striking and disturbing. Repeated skin damage around the mouth and gums can cause the lips to tighten and recede, making the teeth appear more prominent and creating an expression that might be interpreted as predatory or menacing. The combination of pale, scarred skin and apparent dental abnormalities could easily have been seen as evidence of supernatural transformation, particularly in societies where physical deformity was often attributed to divine punishment or demonic influence. Perhaps even more significantly, some forms of porphyria can cause severe abdominal pain and neurological symptoms that might have driven sufferers to seek relief through unusual means. There are documented cases of porphyria patients experiencing temporary relief from their symptoms after consuming blood, possibly due to the heme content providing their bodies with the chemical components they were unable to produce naturally. Such behavior, witnessed by communities unfamiliar with the underlying medical causes, could easily have been interpreted as vampiric feeding. The genetic nature of porphyria also helps explain why vampire legends often spoke of vampirism running in family lines or being passed from parent to child. In communities where multiple family members suffered from the same genetic condition, The appearance of similar symptoms across generations might have seemed like evidence of a hereditary curse or supernatural affliction that could be transmitted through bloodlines. Another medical condition that may have contributed to vampire legends is catalepsy, a neurological disorder characterized by muscle rigidity and a temporary loss of consciousness that can make individuals appear dead when they are actually in a catatonic state. Before the development of modern medical diagnostic techniques, people suffering from cataleptic episodes might have been pronounced dead and buried, only to recover consciousness while trapped in their coffins. The horror of premature burial was a very real concern in earlier centuries, when medical knowledge was limited and the signs of death were not always clearly understood. Individuals who were buried alive and managed to claw their way out of shallow graves or were discovered during exhumation would have appeared to rise from the dead, providing apparent evidence for beliefs about vampiric resurrection. The physical evidence left by premature burial could have been particularly convincing to communities predisposed to believe in vampires. Fingernails broken from scratching against coffin lids, blood around the mouth from desperate attempts to breathe or call for help, and the general disheveled appearance of someone who had been trapped underground would all have seemed consistent with traditional descriptions of vampires emerging from their graves. Rabies, one of the most feared diseases of the pre-modern world, presents symptoms that align remarkably well with traditional vampire characteristics. The later stages of rabies infection can cause extreme sensitivity to light and sound, violent behavior, and an apparent aversion to water that could be interpreted as the vampire's legendary inability to cross running streams. Rabies patients often develop difficulty swallowing, leading to excessive salivation that could be mistaken for the bloody foam traditionally associated with vampiric feeding. The behavioral changes associated with rabies are particularly significant in understanding how this disease might have influenced vampire beliefs. Infected individuals may become aggressive and violent, attacking others through biting, which was understood to be the primary method by which vampires spread their condition. The fact that rabies is transmitted through saliva exchanged during bites created a perfect parallel to vampire legends about the creation of new vampires through feeding. The progression of rabies from initial infection to full symptoms can take weeks or even months, during which the infected person might appear normal before suddenly manifesting violent and disturbing behaviors. This timeline could explain legends about people who seem to transform into vampires gradually, developing supernatural characteristics over time rather than through immediate death and resurrection. Pellagra, a disease caused by niacin deficiency, was common in communities that relied heavily on corn-based diets without proper food preparation techniques. The symptoms of pellagra include sensitivity to sunlight, mental confusion and aggression, and distinctive skin lesions that could dramatically alter a person's appearance. In severe cases, pellagra can cause dementia and violent behavior that might have been interpreted as evidence of supernatural possession or transformation. The seasonal nature of pellagra outbreaks, often occurring during times of food scarcity when communities relied most heavily on stored corn, could help explain why vampire incidents were often reported during winter months or periods of famine. The connection between malnutrition and the appearance of apparently supernatural symptoms would have been difficult for pre-scientific communities to understand, making supernatural explanations seem more plausible. Tuberculosis, one of the most common killers in pre-industrial societies, created symptoms and social patterns that may have contributed significantly to vampire folklore. The disease often affected multiple family members in succession, creating the appearance of a supernatural curse spreading through bloodlines. Tuberculosis patients typically became pale and thin, developed a persistent cough that might bring up blood, and often experienced a gradual wasting away that could last for months or years. The way tuberculosis spread through families and communities could easily have been interpreted as evidence of vampiric contagion. When one family member died of the disease and others subsequently developed similar symptoms, it might have seemed as though the deceased was returning to feed upon the living, gradually draining their life force and transforming them into similar creatures of the night. The practice of exhuming suspected vampires and finding their bodies in states of apparent preservation might also be explained by the realities of burial and decomposition in different environmental conditions. Bodies buried during cold winter months, in waterlogged soil, or in coffins that limited air circulation might decompose much more slowly than expected, retaining a lifelike appearance for extended periods. The accumulation of decomposition gases in buried bodies could cause what appeared to be fresh blood to emerge from the mouth and nose when the corpse was disturbed, creating the impression that the dead person had been feeding on blood. The natural shifting and settling of bodies during decomposition could make it appear that corpses had moved within their coffins or changed position since burial. Psychological factors may have been equally important in creating and maintaining vampire beliefs. Mass hysteria and suggestion could cause entire communities to interpret normal events as supernatural occurrences, particularly during times of stress, disease outbreak, or social upheaval. When communities were primed to expect vampiric activity, ordinary coincidences and natural phenomena could be reinterpreted as evidence of supernatural intervention. The social function of vampire accusations in identifying scapegoats for community problems should not be underestimated. During epidemics or times of hardship, communities might focus their fears and frustrations on particular individuals, often those who were already marginalized or different in some way. People suffering from visible medical conditions, mental illness, or social isolation were particularly vulnerable to being labeled as vampires or supernatural threats. Sleep disorders, particularly sleepwalking and night terrors, could have contributed to vampire legends when individuals were observed moving about during nighttime hours in altered states of consciousness. Sleepwalkers might be found in unusual locations with no memory of how they arrived there, while people experiencing night terrors might display violent or disturbing behaviors that could be interpreted as evidence of supernatural possession. The phenomenon of sleep paralysis, in which individuals become conscious but unable to move while experiencing vivid and often terrifying hallucinations, might have contributed to accounts of vampiric visitation. People experiencing sleep paralysis often report the sensation of an evil presence in the room, difficulty breathing, and the feeling of being held down by an invisible force, all of which align closely with traditional descriptions of vampire attacks. Ergotism, caused by consuming grain contaminated with ergot fungus, can produce symptoms including hallucinations, convulsions, and a burning sensation in the extremities that might have been interpreted as evidence of supernatural affliction. Communities that consumed contaminated grain might experience mass outbreaks of apparently supernatural symptoms, leading to widespread belief in vampiric or demonic activity. The understanding of these medical explanations for vampire like phenomena does not diminish the cultural and psychological importance of vampire legends, but rather helps us appreciate how human communities have always sought to make sense of the frightening and inexplicable aspects of existence. The transformation of medical symptoms into supernatural narratives represents a fundamental human tendency to create meaning from chaos and to find patterns that help explain the random tragedies and mysterious illnesses that have always been part of the human experience. Modern medicine has provided us with the tools to understand the biological basis of conditions that our ancestors could only explain through supernatural frameworks. But this scientific knowledge does not eliminate the psychological and cultural needs that vampire legends served. These stories continue to resonate because they address fundamental questions about mortality, disease, and the fragility of the boundary between life and death that remain relevant regardless of our level of scientific understanding. As we move toward the realm of sleep, where the rational mind relaxes its grip and allows older, more primitive forms of consciousness to emerge, we can appreciate how vampire legends represent humanity's ongoing attempt to understand and cope with the mysterious aspects of existence that continue to challenge us even in our age of advanced medical knowledge. As our journey through the shadowy realm of vampire legends draws to a close, we find ourselves in the curious position of living in an age where ancient fears have been transformed into sources of entertainment, romance, and even aspiration. The creatures that once terrified our ancestors, driving them to dig up graves and burn corpses in desperate attempts to protect their communities, have evolved into some of the most beloved and commercially successful characters in modern popular culture. This transformation represents one of the most remarkable cultural shifts in human history, demonstrating how profoundly our relationship with death, darkness, and the supernatural has changed as we have moved from agricultural societies where survival was precarious to modern urban civilizations where technology has seemingly conquered many of our ancestral fears. Yet the persistence and popularity of vampire stories in contemporary culture suggests that these ancient archetypes continue to serve important psychological and social functions, even as their surface meanings have been dramatically altered. The 20th century marked the beginning of the vampire's transformation from figure of terror to object of fascination, a process that accelerated with the development of cinema as a mass medium. The early vampire films of the 1920s and 30s, most notably F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu and Tod Browning's Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi, established visual and narrative conventions that would influence vampire portrayals for decades to come. These films retained much of the horror associated with traditional vampire legends, while adding elements of gothic romance and aristocratic glamour that would prove increasingly important as vampire stories evolved. Bela Lugosi's portrayal of Count Dracula became the definitive cinematic vampire for an entire generation, establishing the image of the vampire as a sophisticated European aristocrat with a hypnotic gaze and an irresistible charm that could overcome his victims' natural instincts for self preservation. This characterization built upon the romantic vampire tradition established by Polidori and refined by Stoker, but the visual medium of cinema gave these qualities a immediacy and power that written descriptions could not match. The success of these early vampire films demonstrated the commercial potential of vampire stories and established horror as a legitimate genre of popular entertainment. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, vampire movies became a staple of Hollywood production, with studios like Universal Pictures creating entire franchises built around iconic monster characters, including Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and the Wolfman. The 1950s and 60s saw vampire stories begin to reflect changing social attitudes towards sexuality, authority, and individual freedom. Films like Horror of Dracula, starring Christopher Lee, presented vampires as explicitly sexual beings whose appeal was as much erotic as it was supernatural. This sexualization of vampire characters reflected broader changes in social attitudes towards sexuality and helped establish the vampire as a figure of forbidden desire rather than pure terror. The British Hammer film productions became particularly influential during this period, creating a series of vampire films that emphasized color cinematography, gothic atmosphere, and explicit violence and sexuality that would have been impossible in earlier decades. Christopher Lee's portrayal of Dracula was more physically powerful and openly sensual than previous versions, establishing the vampire as a figure of dark masculinity that combined predatory violence with irresistible sexual appeal. The 1970s marked a crucial turning point in vampire evolution with the publication of Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire, the first novel in what would become the Vampire Chronicles series. Rice's work revolutionized vampire fiction by presenting vampires as sympathetic characters whose immortality was both a gift and a curse, beings capable of love, remorse, and spiritual growth despite their need to feed on human blood. Rice's vampires were not the aristocratic predators of earlier literature, but complex individuals struggling with questions of morality, identity, and meaning that resonated with contemporary readers seeking spiritual and emotional authenticity. Her vampire Louis was portrayed as a reluctant killer tormented by guilt over his predatory nature, while Lestat represented a more hedonistic approach to immortal existence that celebrated the sensual pleasures and freedoms that vampiric powers could provide. The success of the Vampire Chronicles established vampire fiction as a legitimate literary genre capable of addressing serious themes while entertaining readers with supernatural adventure and romance. Rice's influence can be traced through virtually every subsequent work of vampire fiction, from urban fantasy series to young adult novels to television shows and films that continue to explore the psychological and emotional dimensions of vampiric existence. The 1980s and 90s saw vampire stories become increasingly diverse and sophisticated, with writers exploring how vampire characters might function in contemporary urban settings, technological societies, and multicultural environments. The Lost Boys introduced teenage vampires who use their immortality to create eternal adolescent rebellion, while television series like Forever Night and movies like Near Dark examined how vampires might adapt to modern life while maintaining their essential supernatural nature. This period also saw the emergence of vampire role playing games, most notably Vampire, the Masquerade, which allowed players to explore vampiric existence from the inside, making choices about how to balance their supernatural nature with their remaining humanity. These games demonstrated the extent to which vampires had evolved from figures of terror into characters with whom audiences could identify and empathize. The late 20th and early 21st centuries have witnessed an explosion of vampire themed entertainment that has transformed these creatures into one of the most commercially successful genres in popular culture. The success of television series like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel demonstrated that vampire stories could sustain long form narrative development while addressing contemporary issues ranging from feminism and sexual identity to corporate corruption and environmental destruction. Buffy the Vampire Slayer was particularly influential in establishing new conventions for vampire fiction, creating a universe where vampires were integrated into modern society and where the boundaries between good and evil vampires were clearly defined. The show's combination of horror, comedy, romance, and social commentary proved that vampire stories could appeal to broad audiences while maintaining their essential supernatural elements. The Twilight phenomenon of the early 2000s represented perhaps the most dramatic transformation of vampire mythology, presenting vampires as romantic heroes whose supernatural powers made them ideal romantic partners rather than threats to be feared or destroyed. Stephenie Meyer's vampires sparkled in sunlight rather than burning, possessed supernatural beauty and grace, and struggled with their predatory nature in ways that made them sympathetic rather than terrifying. The success of Twilight demonstrated the extent to which vampire stories had evolved from their origins in folklore and horror fiction to become vehicles for exploring contemporary anxieties about relationships, sexuality, and personal identity. The series sparked a global phenomenon that included not only books and films, but also merchandise, tourism, and cultural movements that celebrated vampiric characteristics as desirable rather than monstrous. Contemporary vampire fiction continues to evolve and diversify, with writers exploring how vampire characters might function in increasingly complex modern societies. Urban fantasy series like the Southern Vampire Mysteries by Charlene Harris and the Black Dagger Brotherhood by J.R. Ward have created elaborate fictional universes where vampires exist alongside humans in complex social and political relationships.